Okay, without further ado, I would like to introduce our guest tonight. George Gibson is a banjoist, instrument collector, and banjo historian who began playing banjo in the early 1950s in Knott County, Kentucky. He had a career as an educator, insurance executive, and business owner, but always maintained his interest in the folk music of Southeast Kentucky, and is now a tradition bearer of both the music and oral histories. He attended Caney Junior College, now Alice Lloyd College, and graduated from the University of Kentucky. George first appeared on stage in 1994 as the guest of honor at the Florida Old Time Music Championships, and has since performed at festivals in several states. The Illinois Press recently released a book of current banjo research, Banjo Roots and Branches, in which George has the essay, Black Banjo, Fiddle and Dance in Kentucky, and the amalgamation of African American and Anglo-American folk music. George will be signing copies of that book after the program. I had done a film, as many of you know, about the history of mountain music last year, and the journey of the banjo was included in that film. And I knew that there was this communal transmission of the black banjo to the white community. But I had never found any documentary evidence of that, and so it wasn't included in my film. And George contacted me and said, "You're missing something big in the film." And so I was happy to that he shared his research with me. And I was excited that he was willing to come here and share his knowledge and his banjos. And if you think there's a lot of banjos, from what I understand, he has over 100. So this is really a tip of the banjo iceberg. So without further ado, George Gibson.
I told a little story out in the hallway out there a while ago. I'd forgotten about this. Somebody asked me one time what I do for a living, and I said I play the banjo, dance, sing, and tell lies. And I've got a newspaper article to prove it. Now, I've been gone from East Kentucky for the better part of 50 years, 55. I started going back fairly regular in the 90s, and the local newspaper has a possum on their masthead, and every year at that time they were printing t-shirts with possums on the t-shirts, and I would go over and buy some for friends. So I went over with my nephew. I had a pair of overalls on. Don't know why, but I did. My nephew was with me, and he had a red handkerchief around his head and a big gold chain around his neck. And this lady sitting there, I was talking about the t-shirts, she said, "You don't look like you're from around here." Well, that sort of tweaked me a little bit, you know. So she got her pen out and she said, "What do you do for a living?" I said, "I play the banjo, dance, sing, and tell lies." And she got up, she kept writing and talking to me, and I kept talking, and she took a picture of me beside their stuffed possum. I didn't think anything about it. Next week, the local newspaper came out and opened it up. There's a picture of me with the possum. And in the first paragraph, it said, "George Gibson has a wonderful career. He plays the banjo, dances, sings, and tells lies." Well, I called her up and I said, "Mrs. Hicks, you should have known I was joking." She said, "Oh no, I called two people and they both said it was all true." I am from Southeast Kentucky. I have a farm over there, but I live over here. Where I live in Knott County, Kentucky, 80% of the water table has been destroyed by gas well fracking and coal mining. Gas well fracking was destroying wells there 50 or 60 years ago. However, the EPA only decided that it might destroy sources of water 2 years ago. The governors of West Virginia and Kentucky were very effective keeping EPA out of East Kentucky and Virginia. So the place is pretty much decimated. I like living over here because my favorite author James Steele, a poet, a novelist, and a short story writer. He shared the Southern Writers Award in 1940 with Thomas Wolfe for his novel River of Earth. But he was over here vacationing, I believe, in the 50s perhaps, and he sent a picture postcard to his friend, the poet Albert Stewart over in Kentucky, and all he wrote on the postcard was, "If heaven is like this, it'll be all right." So that's a long story why I'm here. The short story is this is just about as close as I could get my wife to East Kentucky because she's a city girl. I met her in Philadelphia. Anyway, we're going to give you a program of banjo history. And this program will be contrary to what you read on the internet and hear. The common theme is the banjo came into the mountains after the Civil War. Well, the banjo was here a long time before the Civil War. The first reference I found to it in North Carolina or South Carolina is from the 1780s. Young people were dancing to the delightful strains of the gourd banjo in the 1780s. And the gourd banjo was prevalent around here, and I'll talk about that later. But I'm going to start, give you a program on the history of the banjo, and give you a review of African instruments, and then give you a review of the instruments that in the minstrel area, which was in the 1800s, the 19th century, talk about some folk instruments, and then talk about the instruments of the late 1800s. But we're going to begin the program with a film from my friend Ulf Jagfors in Sweden. He was very generous in sharing this with me. He and his friend from Gambia, Daniel Jada, brought an accounting, which is this instrument here, to a banjo collectors meeting in 2000 in Concord, Massachusetts. Mike Seeger was there, and he played roustabout on the banjo, and Daniel Jada played a similar tune on the accounting, and they sounded very alike. And since then, there's been a lot of research about the accounting, but we're going to roll a film now of some accounting players. That group was filmed by my friend Jag Force. It's the Jola ethnic group in southern Senegal. They were rice farmers. And one of the things they do in the evening is drink palm wine. You saw the things hanging up on the top of the palm tree. They collect the palm juice and it naturally ferments. And if they don't drink it within about a day, it turns to vinegar. So one of their pastimes in the evening is to get together and play the accounting, sing, and drink a little palm wine. They were rice farmers, by the way. And I have a photograph, I think, from a Harper's magazine somewhere. I couldn't find it, but it shows a caption of a rice farmer, and it shows an African American holding an instrument that looks amazing like the accounting. Now we're going to see a short segment of Daniel Jada playing the accounting. And then I'll tell you about him and all in more detail after this short segment film shows. That was Daniel Jada. I'm going to tell you about him. He went to school in the United States and became an economist. He was from Gambia, from the Jola ethnic group in Gambia. That group is located in Senegal, southern Senegal as well. I believe a pastor and his wife hosted Daniel while he went to school here. He moved to Sweden, and my friend Jag Force as a banjo collector and banjo player in Sweden. And he heard Daniel at a lecture, Daniel recognized the close connection of the accounting to the banjo. And so off brought him to the United States for that banjo collectors meeting. And there's quite a bit in the book about the accounting in banjo roots and branches. Now the instrument, of course, here with the long neck is the accounting. And if you notice, it's played in the same as an old mountain style, which I will call the downstroke style. They pick the bottom string with the first or second finger and do melody notes on that. They pick the top string, which is shorter, like a short string on the banjo, and then they drop the thumb to pick the second string occasionally. It's a very interesting instrument, and some of the music is very delightful, actually. As I said, there's been quite a bit of research on the accounting since then, and quite a bit of it is in that book. Now what we're going to do is roll a film about an instrument that for many years was thought to be the closest ancestor to the banjo. It is the xalam. In Mali, it's called the ngoni. This instrument is in several different ethnic groups around West Africa. It is played by griots or jollies. They are praise singers. That is, someone will hire them to write a song about them, to praise them. Keepers of oral history. In some ethnic groups, it is hereditary. I have some recordings out there that are just for show, and I have one by Sheikh Hamala Jabati, who lives, I think, around D.C., and he has a nice recording of this play. That's what he does. Now, these jollies or griots were sort of feared on occasion because they could write a song about somebody that wasn't flattering if they didn't like what the fellow did, you know. But now, as I said, this is hereditary instrument in most of the ethnic groups, but in some, a young person can take it up and become a jolly or a griot. They make their living by playing the music, keeping the oral history, doing praise singing, and that is the second instrument, and I'll talk more about it after we see this little clip. That is a person in Gambia named Abdul Hussein. He is a griot, and the xalam, depending on the ethnic group that plays it, has a varying number of strings, but in the Wolof ethnic group in Gambia plays the one with 5 strings, which is the second instrument on the left here. They also make another interesting instrument. It's called the xalam gizer. And it has a gourd body, small gourd body with a floating bridge like the conting has. Now the conting has a bridge like the banjo. It sits on top of the vellum or the hide or the plastic for the modern banjo. Whereas the xalam has a semi-spiked body with the bridge sitting right on the end of the neck. Quite a bit of difference. There's many references to these instruments in Africa. But when we get to the early banjo, you have the most references to it in the West Indies, in the Caribbean. Now I'm going to pause for a minute and take you back to Africa in 16, 20, and 21. I'm going to tell you why I'm doing that. I grew up in East Kentucky among mixed race people. The academics call these people triracial isolates. They came out of East Virginia. They came down through North Carolina and spread to western states. East Tennessee, where a lot of these people who were mixed race, and over in East Kentucky. When I grew up, the most musical family, they were all my father's age. My father was born, or near his age, he was born in 1900. Very musical family, mixed race, but they were accepted in the white community. The individual in the family that looked most African American was often recruited to play for a local square dance. People got interested in genealogy and they got into Melungeon ancestry. Melungeon was a pejorative used in regard to dark-skinned people in East Tennessee. And the 2 prominent names among the Melungeons were Gibson and Collins. And my father told me when I was a boy, he said, you know, this Gibson lived on the point across from my grandfather, and although he was black, he claimed to be Portuguese. And I never forgot that. So when I started researching the banjo, seriously, I have always been researching music because I grew up in a culture that was broken and shattered because so many people had left for Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, and other states that half the houses up and down the creek were empty. And when I learned to play banjo, everybody was learning to play bluegrass at that time, which is quite different from old-time banjo. Bluegrass is a heavier instrument. It's an ensemble instrument. You play it with steel picks. A neighbor, about 7 years older than I still played the old-time music. He had learned from some people up the creek. So I picked up and traded for a banjo and started learning. And then after I'd driven everybody near insane beating on that thing, my father picked it up one day and started playing. I'd heard a rumor that he played with each other. But he, like most older people, hadn't played in probably 10 or 15 years. So what I did was traipse up and down the roads and try to find some old timer that still played banjo. I had a banjo, and those who had played didn't. My father had a country grocery store, so occasionally a person stopped by whom I knew had played the banjo, and I'd have him play a tune or two. And then the only person that had a banjo was a moonshiner. He sold a half pint of moonshine for $1, so I'd go down and buy a half pint, and I'd have a sip or two, and I'd offer him one. And I didn't sip too much. I let him get the most of it, and then after we finished that half pint, he'd say, might as well get out some liquor, and he'd haul out a quart and get his old banjo and start playing. So I learned a few tunes that way. Plus, I was born in a log home that was built by one of the earliest dulcimer makers in the area, and he was a friend of my father's. So I was interested in all types of music. It was part of a culture that was dying, and it had practically disappeared, so I held on to it. And then when I went to the first banjo collectors meeting in 1998, I learned, to my astonishment, the banjo came in the mountains after the Civil War. So I decided to do further research and see what I could do about that. So I've researched the history of the dulcimer and the banjo since. And the most popular musician in this area is David Hope. If you get on his website, or if you go to YouTube, as I did, and search for David Hope, banjo history, he stands up there and tells you that the banjo came in the mountains after the Civil War, and this white man Sweeney learned and taught everybody else to play, including all those mountaineers. But the people who have written the history of the banjo are from outside this area, and the same thing happened in the 1800s. I'll get into that a little later, but as far as the history of the banjo is concerned, I'm going to read you something from a historian of Western North Carolina. Has anybody read John Preston Arthur's History of Western North Carolina from 1730 to 1913? Very interesting history. You should read it. A friend of his said, was quoted by a biographer of saying, more than anyone, Mr. Arthur went to local sources for his information. He read old journals, letters, etc. He interviewed early settlers, and he was born in 1851. He grew up with soldiers returning from the Civil War. And this is what he had to say about the banjo and fiddle in Western North Carolina. He said, the banjo and fiddle has been as constant companions of the pioneers of North Carolina as has the banjo and fiddle and the hymn book. And there's many references, by the way, to the gourd banjo all through the mountains. But now I'm going to talk about the banjo in the Caribbean. And there's lots of information in this book out here, Banjo Roots and Branches, about the banjo in the Caribbean. But the best book, if you're interested in that, is Dina Epstein. She was a librarian. She wrote a book called Black Sinful Tunes, Black Folk Music to the Civil War. And she has lots of information about the banjo in the West Indies, in the Caribbean. There's all sorts of references to a four-string banjo, and that is the fourth banjo in. You notice it has a flat fingerboard, whereas the conting and the hollow have a round neck, and the strings are tied off, and you pull those loops to tune the thing. Whereas with the early banjo in the Caribbean, it has four strings, it has a fifth string, but it has pegs. It is a Creole instrument. It is a hybrid instrument. It has certain European features and certain features from the African instruments with the gold body, etc. Now to go to Africa in 1620 and 21, a guy named Richard Jobson sailed up the Gambia, and he wrote a book about it called The Golden Trade. This group of entrepreneurs in London and England had financed his voyage to search for sources of gold. He found up and down the Gambia River, all the trade was controlled by a group of people he called renegade Portuguese. Some were black, some were lighter skinned, they were Christian. And they did not like to be classed as African. They were traders that controlled all the trades. That frustrated the British at that time. They spoke several languages usually, and they had a language of their own, Creole. And one of the things he said was, a lot of slaves have been taken from this area to the West Indies. So that these people are now called luso-africans because they were descended from the Portuguese that had African wives. And they were all along the west coast of Africa. Ira Berlin wrote an interesting book called Many Thousands Gone about the Atlantic Creoles. And the Atlantic Creoles were mostly the luso-africans who were descended from the Portuguese. I think they were instrumental in developing the early banjo. Now, in this book, the theory that's put forth is that it developed in the Caribbean, but I found two references to the same banjo in another country in West Africa, Sierra Leone. So I think it developed among these people. Now, their culture was decimated during the colonial times. They defined their ethnicity or race by what they did. They were traders. By their religion, they were Christian. And by their descent, they were descended from the Portuguese. So they were Portuguese, but during the colonial area, there was a lot of pushback. If you're dark-skinned, you're African. You live in Africa. So that culture was pretty much decimated during the colonial era. But I'm sure that they were involved in developing the early banjo because they had customs from the Portuguese as well as native Africans. Now, many of them were enslaved and sent to the West Indies. And interestingly enough, the first slaves in colonial America were from the West Indies before 1700. Now, a lot of these early slaves became free. It was anonymous early on what their status was. Were they slaves? Were they indentured servants? And it was only over time that slavery and racism developed. Racism developed along with slavery. But for a period of time, let's say from about 1640 to 1680, these Atlantic Creoles or luso-africans, a lot of them married indentured servants, white female indentured servants, and had families around the Chesapeake. And early on, these families were treated no different than any other families, and this was documented in an interesting book called Mine Owned Ground. But as racism developed, these people hit the frontier because their children were dark-skinned, and they were in danger of being enslaved, kidnapped, and it happened. So they sort of hung together on the frontier. They came down through North Carolina and spread west from there into East Tennessee, Southwest Virginia, Kentucky. And they were always sort of separate. And in East Tennessee, this one particular group was called Melungeon. And the prominent names among Melungeons was Gibson and Collins. And there were a lot of Gibsons and Collinses in the area where I grew up. Some were called Black Gibsons, some were called Black Collinses, but they were accepted members of the community, but it was suspected that they had African ancestry. Now, when people got interested in Melungeon ancestry, they wrote all sorts of nonsense about it, but eventually ended up doing a DNA test. Now, of course, with the threat of slavery, you did not want to claim any African ancestry. So you were claimed to be Cherokee, anything except African American. And that's one of the legacies of slavery. But a lot of these people ended up in East Kentucky. And one of the most interesting accounts I read was from Breathitt County. A gentleman named William Lincoln in London heard an abolitionist speak, and he decided to dedicate his life to ending slavery. So he approached the president of Berea College at that time, and he gave him a contact in Breathitt County. This was about 1856. And this gentleman in Breathitt County didn't want known that he was sympathetic to anti-slavery notions. So he took him to a church that had a black preacher. And there were slave owners there, and white folks as well as black folks. And a friend of Lincoln made an interesting proposition. He said, if you see a person come in and you can't tell whether they're black or white, tap me on the knee. If you think they're white or black, left knee or right knee. And 11 people came in that Lincoln couldn't identify as either black or white. And his friend told him later, he said one of those fellows had killed a man because of claiming he was black. Now, there were mixed race people all over East Kentucky. There were nominally white. Early on, there were a lot of trials about voting rights and various other things where people claimed to be Portuguese in disparate areas around Virginia, North Carolina, even going into some of the Midwest states. And I think that connects with people who had lost knowledge of how their ancestors arrived here, enslaved, but had retained the knowledge that they were Portuguese. So I think that's how a lot of the banjo playing got into East Kentucky. Now, the gourd banjo here is featured in this painting that was well known. It's in the Ever Rockefeller Museum at Colonial Williamsburg, and it shows a gourd banjo, people dancing to it, with 3 long strings and 1 short string. This is a very interesting banjo. There were a lot of references to 4-string banjos. I've seen references to 1-string banjos, 2-string banjos, 3-string banjos, 4-string, and surely there were 5-string banjos also out there before they were manufactured beginning in the 1840s. The first banjo here is an 1840s banjo that was manufactured in Baltimore by a guy named William Boucher, the first guy who manufactured these things on any scale. Okay. Now, the gourd banjo that has the 3 long strings and 1 short, I'm going to have Cliff Hicks play a little tune on it for you, if I can get him down here. And if we can get this thing tuned up. One of the people in East Kentucky who wrote a lot about the folk music of southeastern Kentucky was Dr. Josiah Combs. He wrote a book entitled Folk Songs of the Southern United States. And he wrote about songs that came from African Americans and songs that came from other sources. But the oldest dance tune that was always used 90 to 95% of the time, if a long banjo player was playing for a dance, was hook and line. And I'm going to have Cliff play a little bit of that for you on this 4-string gourd banjo.
Take hook, I take line. We go fishing in the summertime. You get a line, I get a pole. We'll run down to the fishing hole. My mistress promised me when she dies she's gonna set me free. Shout, Lulu, shout your best. Your old grandmammy's gonna rest.
A four-string banjo can sound quite good when you get somebody that knows how to play it. And I'll talk a little bit about the gourd banjo. It was prevalent throughout the mountains. I think I mentioned earlier that Samantha Baumgartner made the first banjo